In this video, we will talk about leadership. This video is based on Chapter 5 in Lunenburg and Ornstein's Educational Administration Concepts and Practices, published in 2011 by Cengage Learning. We will talk about the nature of leadership first, then we will move on to discussing trait theories, then we will discuss behavior theories, and touch upon contingency theories of leadership. We'll talk a little bit about leadership styles and some other contemporary perspectives of what leadership is. So, humans have always been interested in leadership, right? Leadership is so important in all spheres of our life that we've been trying to understand what it is and how it works for many, thousands of years, I bet. So, the first, written discussions of leadership are attributed usually to Plato's Republic, which was so-called, we can say published, I guess, in 400 before Christ. And there we see the first kind of more or less consistent written discussion of what leadership is, right? And since then, many attempts have been made to define leadership, and it's not so easy as it seems. Among many, many definitions that exist out there, one definition of leadership, which is more or less accepted by many experts currently, is as follows. Leadership is the process whereby one individual influences other group members towards the attainment of defined or organizational goals. If you look at it, this definition has three important aspects. So first, leadership involves influence, right? Leaders influence things like organizational structure, culture, motivation, things that we have already covered in this course. Leadership also influences, other things which we will study a bit later in this course, things like decision making, communication, change, curriculum, teaching and learning, and HR management. The second aspect of this definition is that leadership involves goals, attainment of goals, right? Basically, you can infer that effective leaders are those who help attain goals, whereas ineffective leaders, they are not effective in goal attainment. Third aspect of this definition is that leadership requires followers. Okay, basically, one cannot lead without followers. Importantly, also, leadership is reciprocal, right? It's not just that leaders influence followers. In fact, followers also influence leaders, right? Another idea related to this is that formal leaders that have position power can be distinguished in contrast to informal leaders who don't have position power, but they might have some special skills or talents that give them authority. To fully understand what leadership is, we need to examine the difference between leadership and management, right? These two terms are often used interchangeably. However, they are, not identical, and even though they overlap sometimes, we need to clearly distinguish these two concepts, leadership and management. Okay. So there've been a lot of publications addressing the difference between leaders and managers. So among the first widely known is Zelaznik's paper in Harvard Business Review, where he basically distinguishes leaders from managers based on what they advocate, right? So according to Zelaznik, leaders advocate change and new approaches. In contrast, Zelaznik argues that managers advocate stability and the status quo. Okay, that's one way to look at it. Let's say this was this was an early way of looking at this difference. Later, more recently, we have more comprehensive, explanations or theories or conceptualizations of this difference between leaders and managers. So, according to Cotter, leadership is about coping with change. Notice the difference, right? Not just advocating change, but really coping with it. Management is about coping with complexity, right? And according to Cotter, leadership creates uncertainty and change and involves developing a vision for the organization, aligning people with that vision through communication, and motivating people to action through empowerment and through basic needs fulfillment, right? So there is a lot going on here, right? And according to Cotter, management reduces uncertainty and stabilizes the organization by planning and budgeting, organizing and staffing, controlling and problem solving. So, yeah, these two perspectives should kind of help you to clearly distinguish leadership from management. So the main takeaways are that first, good leaders are not necessarily good managers, and good managers are not necessarily good leaders, right? The second takeaway is that good management skills transform a leader's vision into action and successful implementation, right? And many scholars these days agree that successful implementation is the driving force of organizational success, especially in organizations like schools, which tend to be very stable, kind of domesticated, important to distinguish, right? And the third takeaway is that organizational success requires a combination of effective leadership and management. All right, so let's move on to some theories of leadership, okay? And the first group of theories is called trait theories, right? So basically, originally, why we studied this group of theories first, also it's because the so-called scientific study of leadership, it began by, researching the personal traits that distinguish leaders from non-leaders and effective leaders from ineffective ones, right? So people thought that there are character traits that distinguish leaders from non-leaders and effective leaders from ineffective ones, and they wanted to study that scientifically. Okay, let's look at what came from that thinking. So research in this trait theory's direction have identified that indeed leaders compared to non-leaders and effective leaders compared to not ineffective leaders, they have several character traits that distinguish them. Okay, so the first is drive, the second is integrity, the third is leadership motivation, next self-confidence, intelligence, task-relevant knowledge, emotional maturity, and flexibility. Wow, that's a lot, right? Yeah, but well, leadership is a complex process. So later on, as researchers studied more all of these traits, they realized that all this that long list of traits maps very well into the big five personality traits, which are by now are quite widely accepted by psychologists, and so the studies that focused on studying character traits using the big five personality traits with leadership, basically found that these five big personality traits correlate highly with this earlier distinguished leadership traits. Okay, and if you don't know yet, this highly popularized Big Five model from psychology. The Big Five model includes the following Big Five, character traits such as surgency, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and intellectence. If any of these words sound fancy or, not quite intuitively understandable, what you can do is you can either look up read about them in our chapter 5, or just Google them. There are a ton of sources explaining each of these things, basically describing the main kind of how to say that, the main kind of aspects of human personality. Okay. More recently, there's been an emergence of books, papers in arguing and indicating that there is one more trait in addition to all of those things that may indicate effective leadership, and that is emotional intelligence. You probably heard a lot about emotional intelligence recently, right? This has been like a buzz concept. To me personally, it seems like people have been talking about emotional intelligence all over, everywhere, all the time. I'm a bit kind of it's exhaust. I think it's been exhausting personally, and a little bit biased, right? It's not like by now you probably understand that emotional intelligence is just one of many things that make people leaders or effective leaders, right? So this recent buzz has been implying that emotional intelligence is this key or secret to everything. Well, it's not. It's just an additional another trait, right, among other important traits that may indicate, right? We do not have conclusive evidence about and the deterministic nature of emotional intelligence in many things, including leadership. Okay, so a person who's been very popularly connected to the concept of emotional intelligence is Daniel Goleman. He actually used all the previous work that has been done in the trait theories, in other trait theories, right? And according to Goleman, emotional intelligence has the following dimensions, right? Self motivation, persistence, impulse control, stress resistance, and empathy. Um, According to Goleman, these things collectively may indicate, may help us determine a leader from a non-leader and an effective leader from a ineffective leader. So Goleman and colleagues have done a lot of research in this direction, and one aspect that I would like to talk about in their research is the connection between emotional intelligence and neuroscience. Okay, so basically, studies have shown that cognitive abilities, things like verbal ability and other things, they are connected to the neocortex part of our brain. The part that has been um, developed in our brains quite recently, right? In terms of the long history of the evolution of our brain, right? Whereas the emotional intelligence things, they are performed by the midbrain and with links to the prefrontal cortex. In other words, in the more ancient part of our brains, the parts that have been there for thousands and thousands of years. Okay, and this sort of explains why we find often that IQ, the intellect, and the emotional intelligence are very often independent, right? You could often see that to be a leader, of course, you need to be smart, but you don't have to be super smart. You don't have to be, superiorly academically gifted to be a leader. Okay. Also, I think it's pretty clear and intuitively understandable that people who are intellectually gifted, they can be disasters as leaders, right? So if you get a Nobel Prize winner in some field, um, then it doesn't mean that they can be effective leaders, okay, or leaders at all. So another good thing that comes from all these studies is that aptitudes in leadership can be learned in life and really at any stage in life. Okay, so that also means that leaders are made, not born. So you can learn leadership if you want, if you have the motivation, if you have the resources, then you can really learn leadership. This is really cool news for people who are ambitious and or maybe for people who want to change things and become leaders, and for people who want to become better leaders. The next group of theories of leadership is behavior theories, right? Basically, these theories are trying to understand leadership from another perspective, right? They are trying to compare the behaviors of effective and ineffective leaders to see how successful leaders behave, right? So they are not really trying to see where the leadership comes from, like in trade theories, right? In contrast, they are just trying to observe leaders and kind of come up with was behaviors that successful leaders tend to exhibit, and hoping that perhaps people wanting to be leaders or people wanting to be better leaders could replicate those behaviors and maybe be better at leadership, right? So the focus really shifts from trying to determine what effective leaders are, to trying to determine what effective leaders do. Okay, so and these theories have been developed in this famous studies called the Iowa studies, Ohio State studies, and the Michigan studies, right? Basically, the studies were named according to the place where they have been conducted. So all this, so let's look at this Iowa studies briefly. Let's look at all of them in turn briefly. Iowa studies determined 3 leadership styles: authoritarian, democratic, laissez-faire. Basically, authoritarian, you understand. Democratic is also pretty good. Laissez-faire basically means, oh, do whatever you want. Basically, no leadership kind of style. Okay, so some main findings from the Iowa studies are as follows. So first, subordinates tend to prefer the democratic style the best among these 3 styles. Okay. The second finding is that subordinates prefer laissez-faire style over authoritarian. So people don't like to be pressured. They don't like the authoritarian style. They prefer no leadership at all to an authoritarian leadership. The third interesting finding is that authoritarian leaders elicited apathetic or aggressive behavior. And the next finding is that laissez-faire leaders produced the greatest amount of aggressive behavior. Interesting, right? So people prefer laissez-faire over authoritarian leadership. However, when you look at the outcomes, laissez-faire leadership produces more aggressiveness. People don't like it. So basically, this is a very obvious discrepancy between what we like and how we behave in what we like and how we report. Things that we report that we like. And between how those things that we think we like, how they affect us, how they affect our behavior. And finally, interestingly, productivity was slightly higher under authoritarian leadership compared to the democratic leadership, and lowest under laissez-faire leadership, right? Another kind of obvious discrepancy. We don't like authoritarian. We prefer democratic style, but we're not as productive under it. And we like laissez-faire over authoritarian, but we are the least productive under laissez-faire leadership. Very interesting studies which laid ground for many future studies from which we learned a lot about leadership. Okay. And next, the Ohio State studies, they focused on what types of behavior leaders display, okay, and how do those behaviors displayed by leaders affect performance and satisfaction, okay. Well, they used a mathematical technique called factor analysis, basically a form of statistical analysis that groups a lot of factors into, bigger underlying factors, right? So you could report a ton of things, but then factor analysis helps us to kind of use various aspects of those factors and group them into bigger factors. So they found that there are 2 big factors that about leaders' behaviors that affect group performance and satisfaction. And factor 1 was initiating structure. That includes things like focusing on goals, organizing and defining tasks, assigning work, establishing channels of communication, and other things. And the second big factor was consideration. included the extent to which a leader exhibited trust, respect, warmth, support, concern for the welfare of subordinates. So basically, kind of human-oriented factor. Right? So notice these two factors, initiating structure and consideration. You will see in things we discuss later how this Ohio State studies, they also laid ground for many future interesting studies of leadership, and basically that these two factors, what turned out to be really important. And in general, this two-factor framework turned out to be very research productive. So Michigan studies, this was kind of independent from the Ohio State studies, but they came kind of to a sort of similar conclusions, like in essence, right? So their goal was to determine consistent patterns of behavior of effective and ineffective leaders, right? And they found that they talk about production-centered leadership versus employee-centered leadership. Notice how these are kind of similar to factor 1 and factor 2 in Ohio State studies, right? So production state-centered leadership emphasizes employee tasks and how they could accomplish them, right? Whereas employee-centered leadership emphasizes the employee personal needs and interpersonal relationships, kind of the human orientation. So from all of those things that we discussed earlier, behavioral theories, Robert Blake and Jane Mouton came up with a leadership grid. You can see the whole grid in the book, or just Google it up. Very famous grid, and I think about 81 leadership styles are possible according to that leadership grid, but we will not talk about each of them, of course. There are 5 benchmark leadership styles that could be determined in that leadership grid, right? A grid is basically just a table, right? It has 2 dimensions, one, kind of the y-axis and x-axis, and basically those axes are this production-centered or employee-centered, kind of things. So 5 benchmark leadership styles, according to Blake and Mouton's grid, is authority obedience, country club management, impoverished management, organization management, and team management. So the next group of theories that developed a bit later is contingency theories. So basically, they came about because all these previous efforts, the trait theories, or maybe even the behavior theories, all those efforts to discover one best set of leader traits, or maybe one best set of leader behavior, they all failed. So all, the studies that have tried, once those theories came up, the studies that have tried to validate those theories, they came to mixed results always. Okay, sometimes, certain character traits identified as, important for being a leader, they were, they showed statistically significant relationship with outcomes, things like, productivity and satisfaction. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes some behavior were important determinants of productivity and satisfaction. Sometimes they weren't. And from all of those studies, contingency theories emerged. This whole idea that effective leadership behavior and in general leadership in general is contingent or depends on the situation, right? And so this idea is now really more prevalent today. So we are those trait theories and behavior theories, they are sort of the thing of the past, right? Note that emotional intelligence, right? That has been receiving a lot of attention recently, like a lot of hype. This is part of trait theories, right? Something that we already moved forward from, right? We do not think that if we have a certain trait, right? If we have, for example, emotional intelligence, then we can say that this leader is going to be an effective one, or this person is a leader. Not necessarily. Really depends on the situation. Okay. isn't it like a very powerful and strong realization and an idea in general? So think about it, right? Whenever next time someone tries to sell you that, oh, we know what makes a difference, this kind of behavior or this kind of character, you should develop that in yourself if you want to be a leader. Well, you can say, you know what, yeah, I understand, nice job, this looks like more of a trait theory or kind of a behavior theory, and we know that you might be right, but not in all situations. So maybe this is a good idea, but we should see whether it works and how it works in various situations. Okay, it might not work in every situation. So some contingency theories are Fiedler's contingency theory, Evans and House's path goal theory, Tannenbaum and Schmidt's leadership style continuum, Redden's three-dimensional leadership styles, and Hersey and Blanchard's situational leadership. All of these theories have been quite useful. I'm not going to cover each of those theories, each of these theories here. One, because I think, more or less, all of them, they build on the previous theories and they build more complex theories, which all communicate this main idea that effective leadership behavior is contingent on the situation. Okay, so however, I'm going to touch a little bit on leadership styles, right? So basically, leadership styles are the manners in which the leaders influence their subordinates, okay? And Tannenbaum and Schmidt, they proposed a continuum. On one end of it is boss-centered leadership, and on the other end is subordinate-centered leadership. So that's one way to look at leadership styles. Okay, so a leader could be anywhere between those two extremes or on one of those extremes, of course. There is also Redden's three-dimensional leadership model, basically simply arguing that effective leadership is the one which is appropriate to the situation. Okay, and there's another theory, Blanchard situational leadership, which argues that the main situational factor is readiness of followers to the leaders, to the things the leader proposes or wants to do. Okay, so you can see that this whole idea, the contingency theory idea, is very powerful, and it has many practical implications, such as perhaps leaders should be assigned or maybe created. They are they are sort of contextual, based on the situational needs, right, and other things. So it kind of also is also this whole concept of contingency theories is kind of humbling, right? So one, a leader which has a very strong performance record could be an ineffective one in another situation, right? And don't we see that with the current pandemic, right? Where things that worked before are no longer working, right? New leaders are emerging. We could discuss this forever, and we could talk about it during class. But I think I generally, personally, also kind of tend to support more the contingencies theories of leadership. Well, let's finish this video with mentioning some other contemporary perspectives which have been studied even less than contingency theories, right? So we have the biggest amount of publications on the trait and behavior theories. Contingency theories are being developed kind of more recently, and right now there is less work done to validate contingency theories, and it's being done now. And this new contemporary perspectives, they are very, very recent, and there is even less work about them than about contingency theories, right? But let's talk about them. Let's quickly mention them. So these are the synergistic leadership theory, leader-member exchange theory, reciprocal influence theory, substitutes for leadership, and transformational leadership. You can kind of see that they are trying to make a step forward from even the contingency theories, right? So just based on their names, and I'm not going to talk about each of these theories in detail, but just based on these names, most of them are quite intuitive. You can see that they are even trying to move away from just leadership depends on the situation, right? They're trying to here, for example, this one even trying to find substitutes for leadership, right? In what contexts we do not need leadership at all, or and other things, right? So, um, who knows? Maybe you will be doing new research in which will examine these theories, or maybe you will propose your own.